Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy and pleased to be talking with Ed Hagen. Ed is a professor at Washington State University in Vancouver. He has his bachelor's in math from UC Berkeley and his PhD in anthropology from UC Santa Barbara. He is interested in many things, primarily on evolutionary medicine. Much of his research takes an evolutionary approach to non-infectious diseases with a focus on mental health. He looks at depression, suicide, self-harm. He's also looked at child growth and development. He's looked at the evolution of leadership. He's looked at evolution of music and dance. And he's done some really wonderful field studies in South America and in Africa. I was really excited to talk to Ed. I've read a lot of his papers, and I've heard so many people that I respect and admire speak very highly of him. So I was very excited to talk to him, and we talked for about 2.5 hours about evolution, but we talk about many of his research topics through the lens of evolution, which may be different for some folks that haven't heard about an evolutionary model of depression, let's say. And so it was really nice to get him to talk about his research in these areas. We start the conversation by talking about the power of evolution, what makes it so essential for understanding so many things about organisms on the planet, including humans. We talk about evolutionary psychology, and we talk about, some of the critics and how it could be defended. We talk about the role of culture and the universality of things. We talk about the history of the evolutionary story of humans, and we kind of walks us through some of the various periods on the earth and how we've evolved as humans. We talk about the evolutionary model for mental health disorders. So he makes this distinction between, dysfunction and harm and how both are necessary there. We spend some time talking about the clinical taxonomy from the DSM-5, and we both kind of converge on some of the criticisms there. And some of the parts of it that are very, I would say, underdeveloped or not the complete picture. We talk about how we define depression with an evolutionary model. We give some criticisms of the very new prolonged grief disorder. We talk about the epidemiology data on depression. We talk about the evolutionary models of postpartum depression and suicidality. And then we talk about some of the cross-cultural elements of many of the topics we discussed in the conversation. I have to say, Ed is one of those people that is quite brilliant. And you'll hear in the conversation that he is very much entrenched in this data, in this work, and he's very sharp and very clear about looking at the whole perspective. And I greatly admire his work. And he was such a joy to talk to for 2.5 hours. So I'm very happy with the conversation, and I hope that everyone listens is also very happy and learns a lot. And so now I bring you Ed Hagen. I'm here with Ed Hagen. Ed, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to talking to you. You come highly recommended, and so I'm really looking forward to talking about your fabulous work.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so just tell folks just a kind of the brief snapshot of who you are, what you do, what you research, and all the particulars.
Yeah, my name is Ed Hagen, and I'm a professor of anthropology at Washington State University. And I'm specifically an evolutionary or biological anthropologist, focusing on the evolution of human behavior and cognition and emotions. And I specialize in evolutionary medicine, which is taking evolutionary principles and using them to try and gain some insights into what are some of the most intractable health problems we face today, which are mental health problems, depression, suicide, drug use. That's my main area of focus. But I do also work in some other areas, again, taking an evolutionary approach to topics like leadership and religion and knowledge specialization, for example. I also do a little work on music, evolution of music.
Well, it's very cool. Yeah, I'm a big lover of all things music, and so that might be interesting. Maybe we'll touch on that too at some point. I definitely, so I'm in the clinical world, right? So I have the doctorate of psych, and I do clinical work every day. It's my day job, and so I think that will be. I've actually never talked to somebody that looks at evolutionary medicine, and so I think that will be really cool to kind of put our heads together, and you'd love to learn from you and many of the things that the angle you're looking at, some of the same stuff that I'm looking at from another angle. So that might be really, really nice convergence there. Okay, so let's just maybe start first with evolution. So I've talked about evolution plenty on the podcast, right, with many, many wonderful people that have talked about it. So we don't have to go too deep into it because I don't want to repeat myself. But I guess for your perspective, what do you see is the most powerful aspects of evolution? And then we can talk a little bit about kind of ethology, and then kind of evolutionary psychology, and then kind of branch out from there. So I guess just kind of start with, when you think about the evolutionary model, as a general sense, what's the most powerful aspects of it that are so convincing for you that you would have it as a framework to view hypotheses or problems or issues or other things like that in our world?
Yeah, great question. Maybe I could kind of illustrate that answer with how I kind of switched over to evolutionary approaches to human behavior. So I kind of went into anthropology on the cultural side as a cultural anthropologist back in the early 1990s. And I was initially pretty skeptical of the evolutionary approach. But I had to do my comps. And I thought, you know what, the stuff's pretty easy. And all this cultural stuff is really hard. And I'm going to pick an easy topic and just so I can pass my comps. So I asked Don Simons to recommend some readings. He was one of the evolutionary anthropologists in the department. And he assigned this book by George Williams called Adaptation and Natural Selection. And I was like, God, it's from the 1960s. Can't you recommend anything more recent? And he's like, well, this is a classic. I think you should read it. Mm-hmm. And after I read George Williams, I realized that we actually have a scientific model of life, which I really had never appreciated before. And that model is one that has just delivered enormous benefits. And it's thinking of organisms, all organisms, as collections of adaptations, of mechanisms, often complex mechanisms that evolve to enable organisms to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Mm-hmm. And so this is a really powerful model, and it really underlies all medicine. We don't even really think about how natural it is, but every kindergartner knows that the heart is a pump. Mm. And that took centuries, if not millennia, to figure that out. It wasn't easy to figure out that the heart is a pump. But once we figured that out, it just offered tremendous insights into how to treat some very serious health problems, medical problems. And we can think of all the different parts of organisms in this way as complex mechanisms that evolve to solve particular challenges in the environments in which they evolved. So that, for me, is the incredibly powerful idea that evolutionary theory offers us, that we can think about organisms as these collections of mechanisms that evolve to solve particular environmental challenges. So when we're trying to understand an organism, especially a complex one like humans, obviously we study the human body or the human brain. But what evolutionary theory tells us is we need to study the environment. The environment in which that organism involved, including us humans, is going to give us a lot of insights into the kinds of mechanisms that it might have. So it's this close connection between the structure and design of the organism and the structure of the environment in which it evolved that I think is at least one of the real powerful ideas in evolutionary theory that really just gives us a lot of insights that other perspectives don't.
how did you take those aspects and, kind of really, kind of sharpen your own focus in your world of anthropology, right? So obviously there's, you have to, understand evolution and with anthropology and understanding, how people have evolved. But I mean, how did you, particularly you yourself, how did you kind of, take the book and you pass your comps and you move forward, and then in your own research, how did you start using that kind of lens and framework as a nice kind of framework to understand, your work and everything else?
So I ended up at UC Santa Barbara, where kind of evolutionary psychology was more or less invented. And as I just said, I was initially pretty skeptical. But what I realized is that what evolutionary psychologists were doing is taking George Williams and applying it to the brain. And the brain is this organ that is just incredibly difficult to study because we just don't have the technology to see the structure of the brain. The structure of the brain consists of neural networks, and neurons are really small. And it's incredibly difficult to tease apart their structure. So we just really don't have the technology, especially for human brains, to see the kind of structure in the same way that we can see the structure of hearts and the digestive tract and lungs. We can kind of look at those things physically. We can easily look at them under the microscope and get a lot of insight. With the brain, we just don't have the technology to do that yet. And so evolutionary psychology offers us the possibility that we can, instead of looking directly at the brain, we can look at the environment and say, what kinds of problems was this organism facing in this environment? And then that's going to give us some clues and hints to begin to think about what kinds of things we might expect to find in terms of psychological adaptations. And then we can go back and forth. We can begin to design experiments. Does cognition show the kinds of structures that we might expect to find if the challenge that I think is a challenge actually really is a challenge? And the kinds of challenges that I was interested in are social challenges. So I had I kind of came into anthropology really interested in just the social challenges that people face in their everyday lives and just how emotionally powerful those challenges often are, extremely powerful. And as we'll probably get to later on here, a lot of the emotional reactions and psychological reactions to those challenges have been interpreted as brain dysfunctions, as brain disorders. Your brain's not working right. And in some cases, that's true. But my gut instinct was, in a lot of cases, that's not true, that these are really severe challenges, and there's some sense in which it's understandable that people are having really strong emotional reactions to really severe life challenges like sexual or physical abuse or other things like that. And so evolutionary psychology gave me a way to begin to think about that in a more rigorous and scientific way. Could be that we actually have evolved psychological mechanisms for dealing with these challenges, because a lot of them have been around forever. So, a loved one dies and people are often really devastated by that, understandably. But how can we understand that? Well, people have been dying forever and loved ones have been dying forever. It's just had been a constant. Just everybody who's ever lived has faced that at some point. So it's a long-standing part of our social environment, and probably always very often had a really big impact on our biological fitness. So we can begin to think about how we might have evolved psychological mechanisms to deal with those kinds of challenges. So that, for me, was the real promise of the insights that, for me anyway, came from George Williams' work.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, for a while there was some kind of ethology, which looks at this kind of animal behavior in their environments or their ecology, and then very focused on critical periods. Obviously, is kind of these very specific aspects. But then evolutionary psych kind of looks at more of these kinds of sensitive periods as well. And so I guess I want to ask you this is, it's interesting that you were kind of skeptical, and I think when Evolutionary Psych was, kind of having its birth and genesis. Obviously Dave Buss, who's fantastic, he was a big part of that, and many other folks. It's, I think it's normal to be skeptical of like, what's this about? But there's been obviously a preponderance of great scientific research and evidence since then that shows that evolutionary psychology is really good at exactly what you just said, trying to understand psychological mechanisms for humans and where things go wrong and et cetera, right? Which roots it in a kind of very tangible way. But people still don't like it, and people still pick on evolutionary psychology quite a bit. People say it's reductionistic. People say that it's too, it's just so stories. If there's something in the world or the environment or with humans, they're just always trying to just kind of explain it this way. People say that it's too deterministic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe you kind of just lay out a little bit what are some of the I guess some of the most prominent criticisms, maybe some of the ones I just said or other ones, and how do you kind of have sort of a defense to say, hold on, not so fast. This does have a lot of power, and here's why, and kind of where we can see that going.
Yeah. So when I got into evolutionary psychology, it was in the early 1990s. And one way to get an answer to that question is to look at the two papers, I think, that really opened the door to evolutionary psychology. So previously, you're right, the doors in academia were more or less closed, not completely closed, but virtually entirely closed to evolutionary approaches to human behavior. And John Tooby and Lita Cosmides in the early 90s published two papers that really did open the door, so that today I would say evolutionary psychology is more or less kind of a mainstream subdiscipline in psychology. And those two papers, one was The Psychological Foundations of Culture. And that paper made a very convincing case that we can't even begin to really think about culture without thinking about the psychological mechanisms that enable us to acquire culture in the first place. That there's no just natural property of nervous systems that they're going to automatically absorb culture, that you actually need specialized psychological mechanisms to evaluate information, collect information, learn information, use that information, build on that information. And I think that was critical, that many mainstream social scientists who rightly are looking at cultural processes, I think, found that argument convincing, that yes, there has to be an evolution. Not all animals have culture, especially to the extent that we do, and so there must be some evolutionary history behind that, and we're going to need something like evolutionary psychology. So I think that was one critical piece of the puzzle, and I think that kind of shows what some of the resistance had been, is that a very understandable focus on culture was seen as in opposition to, the typical nature-nurture debate. And so that paper is really showing you that you need the nature part to even get to the nurture part. The nurture part just, rocks don't learn, sand doesn't learn, bucket of water doesn't learn. You need just incredible evolved structure to have that kind of learning in the first place. And then the second paper was, I'm not sure if I can get the title exactly right here, but the universality of human nature and the I should look this up, but that was the first part of the title. And that paper made two major points. And the first point is that that evolved human nature really has to be universal in the species. That we can't, and the reason is that our psychological mechanisms show as much complexity and design as every other major organ in the body. So it's not like we find some, exotic tribe that has never been contacted, that doesn't have livers and hearts and lungs. All the bits and pieces of our physiology and our anatomy that you find in one human population, you find in every other population. Not only that, you find them in all of our primate relatives and so forth. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason that all of the complex physiology and anatomy is universal, and that it took an incredibly long time to evolve. And all of the genetic variants that went to fixation, they had to go to fixation first before you could then get the next set of genetic variants to go to fixation. There's this very long cumulative process, and there's no way by which a very complex organ could be evolving in one human population and not in another. So, and the argument from evolutionary psychology is that the brain is going to be exactly like that. We're not going to see any differences. That the same kind of complexity that we see in our circulatory system and our digestive system and our immune system and our skeletal system, we're going to see in our psychological system. And that means that all of those complex psychological mechanisms also have to be universal. And that, I think, was, again, very powerfully influential, because it really showed that any sort of psychological differences that we might see between populations, which of course brings up the specter of racism and genocide, all of the sort of nightmares of the 20th century and then 18th and 19th centuries, that evolutionary psychology is not offering any sort of scientific support for those. That as we investigate evolved psychology, it's really beginning a kind of a scientific investigation for the psychic unity of mankind. And that, I think, put a lot of people's minds at rest, that if we begin to adopt these scientific tools, we're not going to be kind of revisiting some of the horrors of the 20th century and Nazism and things like that. So those things, I think, the fact that it was those two papers that really kind of opened the doors to evolutionary psychology kind of shows the concerns that people had that needed to be laid to rest. Are we really arguing against culture? No. Are we arguing for population differences in psychology? No.
I guess the one thing that I kind of think about with those with the last claim about the kind of universality of things is I can already hear some of the counters here, and you hear it. It's had a little bit of a renaissance recently, where people do this with the idea of emotions. Now, I don't think people will discredit that everyone has emotions, right? Every human has emotions, and other animals have emotions, but people will make claims. This is kind of the constructionist model of, well, you create the emotion, right? You have the propensity to have emotions, right? But you're it's going to be different each time, and it's going to be different for each person. And I'm not entirely convinced by that. I see some of the arguments there, but I kind of do the universalist approach of like, yeah, everyone has emotions, right? And we can know that some of them are universal. I mean, take something like pride, for example. I find that has a lot of universality to it. But I think the expressions of how people all over the world there's variance in how people express something like pride, or anger or joy. But I think there's enough in it to say, this is the same. It's the same phenomenological experience. What it's like to be angry, what it's like to be, feel a sense of pride. Again, how it's expressed or whatever might translate differently. And again, people refute that. They'll say, well, if you go to these certain cultures or these groups, or it's going to be a little bit different. And again, I think that you can put some type of attribution, or even, I don't think you should put morals into emotions, but you could do some kind of, what is a kind of normative thing about how that looks. So I'm thinking of something like shame out in the East, in certain Eastern cultures. It has a different kind of norm than it does here in the West. But there's still the emotion of shame, and there is still I think, some universality to the expression of it. So I wonder there. You don't have to give me any of your opinions necessarily on emotional theory and things like that, but I guess would this kind of be that piece, kind of pulling from that second paper of, the human brain and how it's interacting with the environment. There is some universal aspect of all humans have, these propensities for certain things. How does it, I guess, kind of maybe break down or not?
Yeah, well, let's just take a different example just to illustrate. So language.
Okay.
We all speak languages.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 6,000 different ones on the planet. So it's clear that any specific language is not universal.
Right.
And that language is changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet every human population has some language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's recognizable as a human language. And folks have been working for decades, if not centuries. What is it about language that we all share? And there's no agreement on that yet. So we, obviously most of us are familiar with sort of Chomsky's ideas on this and Steve Pinker's ideas.
This is the language acquisition device and the language instinct and the surface and the deep language or structures and all that stuff.
The deep structure and all that. And so, and we also know that chimps do not acquire language, that there's been really extensive efforts, and they can acquire some rudimentary aspects of language, some words, but they never, even if raised, from the get-go, exposed to human languages and intense training, they never acquire anything like human language. So we know there's something specific about human cognition that enables us to acquire language, but what exactly it is, what's the universal part there, we still don't know. There's still not agreement. Even folks that would all agree that there's some evolutionary story here and that there are adaptations underlying this ability. So we might be in the same place when it comes to emotions, that there can be sort of this kind of simple, discrete model of emotions, that we have things like anger and shame and pride, and they're relatively distinct and universal. And maybe that will end up being the correct account. But it's conceivable at this stage in the game that the story might be more complex. So there's maybe some underlying grammar of emotion, an emotion acquisition device, that where there are universals, there are adaptations, but they don't exactly map neatly onto discrete emotions that are universal across all populations. Now, which way is it going to go? I don't know. So I think the critics who are kind of criticizing universal models of things like anger and shame and pride and guilt that's good. That's really going to sharpen everybody's arguments. And if some of those criticisms hold up, it will really motivate a search for maybe a deeper underlying structure for emotions, or maybe they won't hold up, and it turns out that we've already identified things that anger actually is a pretty unified and universal psychological mechanism. So yeah, it's an open, very interesting scientific question. There's lots of productive debate and empirical investigation. None of that undermines the main argument that whatever those mechanisms are, if they are complex psychological mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms do have to be universal if they are complex adaptations. Even if they don't look the way we think they look right now.
I guess just before we leave this bit of it, is there anything else, I guess, about defending evolutionary psychology, that you would want to say, or something that's, another strong kind of, nail into the ground of sorts of saying like this is what we know. There's a lot of these universals, but anything else, I guess, for maybe some of the detractors or people that want to try and, take away from it, that you would kind of say, no, I think this works. Anything else you would want to defend? Yeah,
well, sort of the nurture side is seen as somehow morally superior. And yet in anthropology, it was kind of recognized by the 1970s that culture can be have some sinister aspects to it as well. So a lot of folks began complaining that anthropology was really exoticizing the other, Orientalism, that somehow we can't, that the other is just this incredibly exotic and incomprehensible being. And so that was can be equally pernicious to sort of essentializing, sort of biological essentialism, is that cultural essentialism is equally pernicious. And kind of makes it seem like, folks living in different places and with different cultures are extremely, almost alien beings. And so there's no scientific framework, that's going to lead us to, that is purely good and is going to, lead us to the truth. So, we really shouldn't, I think academia has kind of wrongly thought that that cultural approaches somehow will never have pernicious consequences, whereas biological ones might. And I think that's just completely screwy. It's actually, if we look at, what is the source of most violence in the world today, it's because you don't have the belief that I do. So, religious wars, what has killed more people from violence than cultural differences? It's really usually rarely biological differences.
Yeah, I think that there's also this kind of space where people will, they'll kind of, I agree, kind of have this kind of inferior or superior kind of thing. And many people will tend to put more of the, this nurture element as if it's, better, or, it's less, it's more wide open, or it's more, you can grow into things or change or evolve, and forgetting the fact that, yes, there can be very pernicious elements to it as well, right? It's not, I try to strip things of their morality first. I mean, you can do that later, but I try to just say, okay, on its merits, how are these things, right? And then, okay, what kind of morals do we want to make sense of it on, if that's appropriate?
I was just reading. I kind of found the manifesto that was posted by the shooter in the Buffalo mass killing a couple months ago, and I was reading through his manifesto, and it kind of came to my attention because he had all kinds of citations to the scientific literature, and it's really a horrifying document. He's like spelling out how he's going to kill people, and then a couple of days later he does it. And it's chock full of citations to the scientific literature on genetic differences between populations. And he's got principal component plots, genetic variation from science and nature. And so many people on Twitter and elsewhere have been really pointing out that here's, an example of extreme violence being motivated by research into human genetic differences. And, very strong argument. There's the shooter exactly doing that. But when you read through it, he also makes a very powerful argument for cultural differences between what he views as, his culture and the culture of the folks he's about to murder. So even in the mind of this guy, culture and cultural differences are playing an equal role to what he perceives as biological differences in motivating his violence. So it just kind of illustrates, that both of these kinds of intellectual frameworks can be used to excuse somebody's violence and aggression.
Yeah. I guess one last question before we move on to kind of some of the more specific work that you've done is just, I guess, kind of on a I guess, what can evolution tell us about the history of humans, right? And obviously that where we come from, right? One of the most fascinating precursors to Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, is probably one of my favorites, just because, if I recall, they're one of the first groups to get up and start walking around and going around the whole planet, right? They were the ones out of Africa kind of thing, at least at mass levels. And, obviously we know now that we're finding new human species all the time. Well, not all the time, but, more recently we found some in different parts of the world, different fossils. And so, we have Denisovans and we have Homo sapiens and we have Neanderthals and Florensis. And so we have different human species that were around at the same time where there was overlap. And so I guess how do you typically, just kind of your perspective, this might be a kind of a different subset of anthropology, but how do you usually understand the evolution of humans, kind of more broadly, in our history of where we're at, how long we've been on the planet, and then for, Homo sapiens in particular and where we're at now. I'll just one quick thing here. I'll try not to throw a wrench in the works for you, but I read the book, the new book that came out, The Dawn of Everything. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't read it, but I've read reviews of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a large book, which I like. I like large books, and some of this I don't have the the training or knowledge to have a very strong opinion on some things. So it's like, oh, that sounds interesting to me. I can't say one way or the other. I'm not close to that literature. It's not my field. But that aside, there were some interesting points that were made in the book that I think were worth considering. And I think that there's very thought-provoking in many ways because it's trying to do this, not revisionist history of humans, but it's trying to do one that is more, I don't want to say inclusive because that word has a lot of baggage now, but more holistic of looking at other things that hadn't previously been considered, right? Which was interesting, which is like, okay, how would that change some things, how we understand? And then other things I was like, yeah, I don't know about that. That doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense to me. But again, I'm speaking from some deficits here, but there's work like that and other works that have tried to understand more and more about our own history of our species and our evolution. So I just kind of your kind of broad overview of the evolution of humans.
I'm kind of curious, which aspects did you find sort of most interesting?
I'd have to look at my notes.
Okay.
I'd have to look at them. But I did write notes down when I read it. I don't have them in front of me, but yeah, I had to remember. I think there was definitely first half of the book where I was like, okay, this is interesting. I guess it was more of just like a type of ignorance on my part of, well, these things I didn't know, right? Like they were spotlighting like, yeah, we're usually told this story about, certain part of human history, but we have this data and we don't talk about how this worked here in concert with that. It was stuff like that. I can't think of a specific example at the moment. Where I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, right? How we do more data, we try and figure things out. But then there was other things where I was like, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, or that seems like a little bit more of this kind of like, a moral or political kind of opinions of theirs that they were putting in. I think it's Graeber that has, some pretty strong opinions, politically and whatnot, which is fine. But so yeah, it was an interesting book. So I'm just curious on, you can talk about that or just your thoughts generally about the evolutionary history of humans.
Yeah. So we know that, or we're pretty sure, and it's still kind of fuzzy because right now we rely primarily on genetic evidence from modern human populations and modern chimpanzee populations to kind of estimate when the human lineage diverged from the chimpanzee lineage. We don't have fossils of the missing link. So we use the genetic differences and the extent of genetic differences between humans and chimps to estimate when that last common ancestor lived. And we estimate maybe 6 to 8 million years ago. And that was at the end of a geological period called the Miocene. It's a very warm and wet period. The world is covered with tropical forests. There's many, many ape species at that time. And the divergence is occurring around a time of climate change, where the climate's going to begin cooling and drying. This is all probably happening in Africa. And coincident with that, we get this divergence where we see the emergence of a new lineage of hominins that have ape-sized brains. So, but they begin at some point, still kind of debate when, but maybe as early as we have some fossils from about 6-7 million years ago that show evidence of bipedalism already. So not so far past the time of the last common ancestor, maybe exactly around that time, interestingly. And so what we see from sort of the end of the Miocene through the Pliocene is the emergence of a group of hominins that are, we can kind of think of them as bipedal chimps. They're walking bipedally, they have chimp-sized brains. Their jaws tell us that they are entering a new dietary niche that involves eating new and different foods than chimps. Their jaws are quite different from chimp jaws and chimp teeth, much bigger, more robust, suggesting that they may be exploiting foods that are more typical of grassland food sources rather than tropical forest food sources. Still lots of debate about that. But they still have chimp-sized brains, basically. Until the end of the Pliocene and the beginning of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the Ice Age, about 2.5 million years ago. And so the species that you were mentioning, Homo, Homo erectus, this is the first fossils that are members of our genus Homo are showing up right in this, again, another period of climate change. So the cooling and drying of the planet is accelerating. We're heading into the Pleistocene, what we call the Ice Age. And this is the first time we begin to see evidence of an increase in brain size. Still not very big. And this is where the story of, or where evolutionary psychology kind of picks up, just as really more as a point of convenience. If we can trace all of our histories back to the origins of life, but just to kind of have some kind of relatively non-arbitrary starting point to think about when we should start think about human evolution is with, as you say, these early members of genus Homo. Brains are still pretty small, not that much bigger than chimpanzee brains. And as you say, these are the first species that we know of anyway to migrate out of Africa. They're still in Africa. They're still evolving in Africa. We now know there's multiple lineages of Homo in Africa. And there's now lineages outside of Africa in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And they are now exploiting, it looks like, yet another food source. The jaws are changing. And we have quite a bit of evidence that they are increasingly exploiting meat, eating meat. And so for the next roughly 2.5 million years, and this is the period that evolutionary psychology focuses on, we have the human lineage brain size tripling in size. And our story, we think, is taking place almost entirely within Africa, although there are these lineages outside of Africa, and the extent to which there's gene flow across those entire populations are not still pretty unclear. But we think that sort of the Eurasian populations are more or less genetically isolated from the African populations, although still huge amounts of debate about that. So the point here is that there's a dramatic increase in brain size, and what evolutionary psychology is arguing is during that 2.5 million period of the Pleistocene, as Homo is evolving in Africa, that the structure that's evolving in that brain, that's the universal psychological structures that characterize all humans today. All of the complex structuring that must be happening as that brain triples in size. Now,
can I make one point about that? Is that It's not only that the brain is becoming larger, but it's also becoming more densely packed as well, correct?
Yeah, there's a number of changes. It's tough. We don't have brains don't fossilize, right?
Right.
So there is work on brain endocasts to try and figure out what's going on. We now can begin to use our extensive genetic evidence. We know certain genes are expressed in the brain. We can kind of begin to see when Human versions of those genes are under intense selection compared to the chimpanzee versions. We can begin to see how some of those genes might be expressed differently in human brains than chimp brains. So there's a number of indirect ways at getting at brain structure of these early hominins, but we always need to keep in mind we actually don't have.
Right.
We don't have their brains. We have the fairly fuzzy imprints of brains on the insides of fossil skulls, and these endocasts, or sometimes some kind of fossilized brains, basically as minerals infused into the cranial cavity. But that's pretty indirect. So. And it's also not my area, so I can't really speak much about what we can say with confidence about that or not. What I do want to say here is there are subsequent migrations. So there's that early migration of early Homo with relatively small brains compared to us, right around 2 million, 1.8 to 2 million years ago, at least based on the fossil evidence we have now. Then there's later migrations out of much larger brained, what we might call Homo heidelbergensis, this time migrating out into Western Eurasia. Those evolve into Neanderthals and Denisovans, or at least we think exactly what the... and then around 80,000 years ago. Now, at 80,000 years ago, we're pretty much at the end, from an evolutionary perspective, we're pretty much at the end of the big story of evolution in Homo. Brains now are fully modern in size. We're basically at the end or near the end of the Pleistocene. And so at this point, the major changes in the brain have already occurred. And we have fully modern humans migrating out of Africa into all areas of the world at this point, and subsequently replacing all the Neanderthals and Denisovans and all the other lineages, Floresiensis and so forth. So the dawn of everything is taking place, is covering stuff that's at the very, very, very end of the story in the upper Pleistocene, the last few tens of thousands of years. And so it's kind of long. It's really at the final page of this evolutionary story. And I don't know. I haven't read the book, but my impression from reading reviews and so forth is it covers, for example, all the archaeological and ethnographic examples we have of complex hunter-gatherers. And so a lot of the hunter-gatherer ethnography that we have are from people like the Kungsan and Hadza. These are small band-level societies. But we also know ethnographically and archaeologically that there were complex hunter-gatherers that lived in relatively large communities. We don't really have any evidence for that kind of complexity until, as I say, the very end of the story here. So, the dawn of everything is kind of right to bring people's attention to some of the more diversity in hunter-gatherer ethnography and archaeology, and that we should begin to rethink it. But we should also keep in mind that all that stuff in an evolutionary perspective is very, very recent.
I think that is an important thing to keep in mind of, we've been around for a while, and it is hard, although there's some really cool stuff with genetics and how we're doing things, with technology. But, there's so many millions of years where we were just roaming about, and it's hard to kind of get at those periods because we just don't have enough of the data directly, or we have to extract some things. So it's interesting to think about. We're talking thousands of years, and we just don't have all of the rich data yet that we wish we could get. And it's interesting to think about how long it's been. And so 50,000 years is a long time, but it's a drop in the bucket when you're talking about 3 million years. It's just fascinating to think about that way. It's really fascinating. Okay, so let's shift here to some more of your specific work. Okay, so really interested in thinking about. I don't want to get too. I've said plenty of times I hate arguments about definitions. What's a disorder?
I'm with you on that.
What's a disorder and what's not a disorder? I don't really want to do that whole thing because you're going to get different answers. But I guess I want to just start with a kind of overview here of because I do want to talk about depression. I think it's your work's fascinating on it. What is your kind of overall, again, evolutionary, etiology, right? That kind of model that is trying to understand mental health disorders overall. I think in one of your papers, you break them into 4 groups, right? There's a dysfunction of cognitive adaptations, senescence, ancient modern environments, and adversity. Adversity is a big thing here, especially with depression.
Right.
So just kind of talk us through your kind of model of how we understand mental health or mental health disorders from an evolutionary perspective.
Right. So I think there is a pretty good definition of disorder from an evolutionary perspective. It's due to Jerome Wakefield, and it's called the harmful dysfunction illness concept. And the concept is that we have, from evolutionary theory, we have a pretty good concept of function. So we can identify, the heart is a pump, and the eye is a camera, and the teeth are tools for chewing food, and the gut digests food, and the immune system fights pathogens. And so we really, when it comes to anatomy and physiology, there's still all kinds of questions we can ask, but we have a pretty good handle on how to get at functionality in anatomy and physiology. And it is this notion of evolved function of adaptation. And so what Wakefield proposes as an evolutionary illness concept or disorder concept is what he calls the harmful dysfunction concept. And there's 2 parts. You need 2 components to be classified as a disorder. One, there's got to be a dysfunction of some function. So, and for the heart, your heart is not beating properly. It's not pumping enough blood, or your lungs are not absorbing enough oxygen. So there's some evolved function or some adaptation that's failing to perform its evolved function. So that's necessary, but not sufficient. And we'll get into some examples of why that is in a moment here. And then it's got to be harmful. So you might think dysfunction is enough, right? If it's dysfunctional, we want to make it functional. But what Wakefield points out is there's all kinds of things that might be dysfunctions that we don't really want to call illnesses because they don't cause harm. They might be dysfunctions.
That was my question. I was trying to think of an example of something that doesn't work, that's dysfunctional, but isn't necessarily harmful. I mean, do you have an example?
So you might think of like a birthmark. The melanin in your skin is not working exactly right. So you've got a birthmark, but it's not harmful. We don't say people have birthmark diseases. Depending on the culture that you're in, you might, start going bald. Your hair follicles aren't working right. And
I know experientially what that feels like. So
that's right. So maybe I was inspired by and but we don't necessarily have baldness illness if we don't think of it as harmful. In fact, there's obviously guys that view it as a benefit.
It's a lot easier to maintain.
That's right.
It's very easy.
And in vasectomies, we deliberately disable a very key reproductive function, but guys are doing it because they actually want to disable that function. So there's all kinds of things that are dysfunctions that we don't call illnesses because they're not harmful. On the other hand, there's lots of things that are harmful that are not dysfunctions. So violence, aggression, jealousy, there's all kinds of things that cause harm, but are probably not dysfunctions. We probably evolved to be aggressive. We evolved to be jealous. We evolved to be competitive. There's all kinds of harmful things that are not dysfunctions. So Wakefield is saying to have an illness, you got to have both. It's got to be a dysfunction and it's got to be harmful. And he actually developed this concept most of his work is focused on psychiatry and psychiatric disorders, and just kind of the philosophy around them. And as you probably know, back in the 70s and earlier, psychiatrists classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. And so Wakefield was trying to come up with a disorder concept that wouldn't classify all these folks as having, a brain dysfunction. Right. And so a lot of his motivation for the early development of this concept, and he said, we don't really know what homosexuality is from an evolutionary perspective. It's still one of the big mysteries out there. But it doesn't matter if it's functional or dysfunctional, if it's not harmful. And it's not. People that are gay, enjoy their lives and view it as a big positive, rightly so. So there's no basis under the Wakefield concept for classifying that. And so, and I'm not totally sure of the history here exactly, but some of these kinds of arguments were influential in actually getting psychiatry to remove homosexuality as a mental illness from the DSM. So it was
the DSM, I want to say 3 in 1980. Is that right?
So DSM-3, Robert Spitzer played a big, huge role in this, and Robert Spitzer and Jerome Wakefield are buddies or were buddies. Spitzer is deceased now, but also collaborators. Wrote some papers together. So, so that's just to give an example. And so I think that's the disorder concept that I use. And I think a lot of phenomena that we classify as mental illnesses are pretty, compelling examples of genuine illnesses, things like schizophrenia and autism. For me, and future research might, and Jerome Wakefield is very clear about this, that in many cases, especially when it comes to mental illness, our classifications are going to have to be provisional because there's so much we don't know. So today we might view something a disorder, tomorrow we might change our views once we have more evidence, or conversely, things that we don't view as disorders today, we might classify them as disorders in the future, again, once we know more. But based on what we know now, pretty strong, I think you can make a pretty strong case that schizophrenia and autism, for example, are genuine illnesses, mental illnesses under the Wakefield illness concept. But I do think there's a class of things that today we classify as disorders that really aren't compelling examples, specifically depression, anxiety, maybe PTSD as well. And there's many reasons why I and others argue that at least most cases of those, and Wakefield is actually one of those he's even written a whole book on how we've really kind of erroneously classified large numbers of cases of ordinary sadness and grief as mental illnesses, when in fact they're almost certainly not. And I would agree with him on that score. And that was when I got into evolutionary psychology in the early 90s as a grad student, that was actually one of the reasons I went into anthropology in the first place, was to try and develop what I thought would be better models of mental distress, because I was very skeptical of the biological psychiatry model of depression. And I didn't really know how to think about it clearly, but I really had a strong sense that folks with depression weren't suffering brain dysfunctions, but were really grappling with genuine adversity with a logic that wasn't totally obvious, but that wasn't a logic of dysfunction, but rather a logic of what I would today call function or evolved function.
Yeah, I want to come to depression, obviously, because you've written about it, and I think it's probably one of the most diagnosed disorders, at least in the United States. I don't know about the global rates. I just one question about taxonomy, if you will.
Yeah.
So in the new DSM-5, Well, it's not new anymore, and there's actually there's just been an update to it. There's now the DSM-5 TR. This is going to be a really tangential footnote clinically. Listeners, you can just tune me out for a minute. This is my hobby horse. But from DSM 1, 2, 3, and 4, we would have the 4, and it was with Roman numerals, and then they would put the TR next to it with the DSM. They had the DSM-3R revised, and they had the DSM-4 TR, which a lot of it wasn't big changes. It was very, very, very small things. And so when they totally revamped the DSM-5, it was stuck in various committees forever. It kept getting delayed. DSM-5, finally comes out in 2013. The DSM-4 TR came out in 2000, I believe, and when there was no changes from the DSM-4 to 4 TR, when the 4 came out in 93, 4, 90, somewhere in there. So really, we're talking about 20 years, which is crazy. With 90s was a decade of the brain, and we had so many advances in medicine and psychiatry and all these things. So it was crazy that really the biggest change we had from 4 to 5 was 20 years, right? Those 20 years was, it's amazing how it took so long. And some of that was political and what have you. But they switched from Roman numerals to, I guess, Arabic numerals, right? Is that what it is? Yeah. They switched it to the 5, right? Yep. And so the idea was, I remember going to a million trainings on this. Well, when they make revisions, which they will, they'll do 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, kind of sort of analogous to the ICD-10, the International Code of Disorders, I think is what it is, which they have 10, 11, I forget which one they're on now, right? And the kind of things like that. It was sort of trying to kind of emulate that. So it's been, almost 10 years since the DSM-5 came out. I'll come back to that in a minute. But they just came out with a new kind of update to it earlier this year. And what did you know? It says DSM-5 TR. It's the wildest thing. I remember just so irritated by that. They made a big deal about switching to the number. It's the stupidest thing. But then they just use the TR. I don't really know the rationale for it. I haven't picked up the TR yet, because they're the only real big change, some of the language stuff, but was bereavement is now in there again, which is they keep flipping that. They take it out, they put it in, they take it out, and I haven't really looked at all of it. I think that was the biggest change, which is I don't know the rationale. It's odd. But the DSM-5, let's just explain this just for listeners real quick. The DSM-5 uses a categorical, polythetic, multidimensional approach, and what that means is that the DSM, as opposed to the DSM-4, which used a multi-axis approach, right? Which is a, you had axis 1, which had clinical disorders. So that would be like your schizophrenia or your bipolar or what depression, things like that. You would have axis 2, which would have your personality disorders, which still need a very significant update. There is an alternative which no one uses, and there's a whole thing with that. There was axis 3, which placed physical disorders, so morbid obesity, or some types of sleep issues or things like that, as an example, or diabetes or hypertension. You'd put the physical stuff there. 4 was kind of your social cultural stuff. You recently were homeless, or neglect, or something like that. And then axis 5 was your global assessment of functioning, which was just a score you would get to show where you're at functionally. So they did away with that, and so they wanted to make it this kind of multidimensional idea, this non-axial way of looking at disorders. And really it came to this idea of, to this point we were talking about in terms of what is really disorderly. And that the polythetic approach is that you could have a different subset of characteristics, but receive the same disorder, right? Which is really good in a sense, right? It's a step, I think, in the right direction of saying, you get 10 people that get the diagnosis of depression, let's say major depressive disorder, but it's going to look 10 different ways. And it's like, well, how could that be? How could you get the same label, right? But you're getting, it just presents differently. It's like, well, you get 10 individuals, right? They're 10 different people. It's going to present, maybe some people have more anhedonia, maybe some people have more of depressed mood, etc., right? Maybe some people have more vegetative somatic symptoms, maybe some people have more of the classic depressive symptoms, etc. And so, they were trying to include for that But it becomes this thing, when I teach diagnosis to grad students, I always say, you can't think of people in terms of diagnosis, for one. But second, a diagnosis is really, if you really think about it, we learn all this stuff just to kind of think about it differently, which is they're just heuristics in my mind, right? It's a way, instead of describing an agreed upon kind of thing, you got to meet 5 symptoms of the 9 within a 2-week period, at least, depression or anhedonia or whatever. We just call that depression. But, really it's just a shorthand for saying you have enough, it presents different, but you have enough things that this person has over here and this person has over here. So instead of just, labeling all the things and taking this long drawn out way to do it, we can just say depression. And it really is a heuristic, but as you know, and as many people know, mental heuristics and rules of thumb, and, they tend to be inaccurate sometimes. They can give you some errors, things like that. So my long tangent here, trying to explain the kind of organization of the DSM, which I have many disagreements with. How do you typically define depression, right? And how do you separate the differences with how we understand these things? Again, this may be just a kind of semantic thing, but it's important. So we have things like clinical depression, such as major depressive disorder. We have now something called persistent depressive disorder, also usually was labeled dysthymia. We have premenstrual dysphoric mood disorder. We have a variety of different depressive disorders that are clinically indicated. But then we also have things that aren't clinical. I guess they could be in their presentation, but they're not disorders, such as someone that's misanthropic, someone that's more of a melancholy kind of person, maybe these things of temperament, things like that aren't clinical disorders. You're starting to look at temperament and style and things like that. So all that to say, how do you usually organize it in your head, from an evolutionary perspective or otherwise, and based on your research of how you understand depression?
Yeah, big question. So my major approach to the stuff I work on, which is depression and suicidality, is as we talked about right at the beginning of the podcast, is what are the environmental challenges and what kinds of solutions would there have been, or could there have been, psychological solutions. And by psychological solutions, I mean some kind of strategy that would deal with, that would, if you're in that situation, would have improved your fitness relative to not having the trait. So, and the kinds of socio-ecological environmental conditions that I'm interested in are ones that we might typically call adversity. So your parent dies, your spouse dies, your child dies, your close friend dies, your sibling dies, your relationship breaks up, your spouse leaves you.
The clinical term, the clinical term we use is a psychosocial stressor. Is that kind of an analogous thing?
Exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
So negative life events, or
right.
things like this. Yes, those are all the kinds of terms that we would use. So I'm thinking about those things as stressors. In an evolutionary perspective, which ones of those would we have faced over and over repeatedly throughout our evolutionary history, and how would they have impacted our ability to survive and reproduce? Or would they have? And many of the major stressors, so if you look at depression, one of the biggest risk factors is death of a loved one.
Yeah.
And if we think about it, well, if you're a younger person and your parent dies, and you're relying on that parent to feed you and protect you, that's a huge threat to your ability to survive and reproduce. If your mate leaves you, that's a huge blow to your ability to reproduce. You can't reproduce without a mate. If that mate abandons your children, We know that in almost all human societies, we rely on other people to help us raise offspring. And so if one person that has a major interest in helping you raise those offspring takes off, it's going to be very difficult for you to make sure your kids survive and grow up and have kids themselves. So if you're in an abusive relationship, all of the injuries that you might suffer from that. So if we look at these major psychosocial stressors, they actually are the kinds of things that probably did occur repeatedly. It's hard to avoid having loved ones die. It's hard to avoid relationship breakups. Almost everybody has been through both of those at some point in their life. And we've all felt bad about it. So I begin to think, what kinds of, when something like that happens, would there have been a response that could have mitigated the negative consequences? Is there something that our ancestors could have done that would have made the situation less bad? Still going to be bad, but is there a way to make it less bad? And the approach, the big approach that I take is the person who kind of formulated this, I think, most clearly and usefully, is a guy, Randy Thornhill, and his then wife, Nancy Thornhill. And they put forward a concept of psychological pain. And this is pretty similar to stuff that Randy Nesse has done and others have done. But the argument here, and it's not specific to depression, but I think it really applies nicely to depression, is that if you have a physical injury, if you break your ankle or break your leg or get a big cut, or it hurts. Yeah. You suffer physical pain. And that physical pain is very disabling. If you break your ankle, you can't walk. If you have an injured arm, you can't use that arm. So the question is, why do we have physical pain? We have special receptors for it, special neural circuits. It's universal. And I think the argument for the evolution of physical pain is that it has a number of really critical functions. First, you have to know that something bad has happened. You need to know that you broke your ankle. And the question is, why do you need to know that? Well, you need to stop walking on the ankle because you might exacerbate the injury, make it worse. So one major function of physical pain is to change your behaviors in ways that prevent you from exacerbating the injury. And then a second major function of the pain is that if especially if you're a kid, you may need to signal for help. Kids fall down, they hurt themselves. What do they start doing? They start signaling, they start crying or yelling. And that's a signal to parents and others that they need help dealing with some physical injury. And then a third function is you need to learn. Okay, I did something dumb and I broke my ankle, and I should not do that stupid thing again. Or I put my hand on the hot stove or the burning log and it really hurt. Don't do that again. So there's a number of really important. So even though you've got the injury, the physical pain is really disabling. You can't walk on the ankle, you can't use your limbs. You may have to, heal for days or weeks or even months in some cases. But we evolved it for a reason. We evolved those kinds of things to deal with that. And what Randy Thornhill proposed is that psychological pain has very similar analogous functions, that we have things in our lives like the death of a loved one or the breakup of a relationship or an abusive relationship, loss of a job, loss of status. All these things would have had a negative impact on our fitness in the same way that a broken ankle did. And the psychological pain is going to serve very similar functions. It's going to focus our attention on that situation. We need to know something bad is happening. And the reason we need to know that is we begin to, if your wife's about to leave you, you might want to think what you're doing to make her leave. And maybe you can change things and prevent her from leaving. Or whatever bad thing is happening, there's things that you can maybe do to prevent the negative consequences that flow from that. So there's that part of it. You may need to learn, okay, your wife is gone or your husband's gone. And so you may need to learn, okay, I need to, whatever, when I get my next mate, if I do, how do I prevent that from happening again? I need to learn from experience. And that negative, that psychological pain is going to be one of the motivators to really motivate you to think about and learn. And then finally, you may need to signal for help. If you're in an abusive relationship, you may need to help getting out of that relationship. If someone dies that you really relied on for critical resources and care, you may need to signal others that you need them to step up and provide the care that you were getting that now is gone. So that's my general approach to what I call aversive but adaptive, and other people have used the same phrase, aversive but adaptive responses to adversity. And I think that much of even what we call major clinical depression actually falls into that category, that it's really not your brain dysfunctioning. Instead, it's that you're suffering particularly severe forms of adversity. Maybe in some cases, ones that we don't even today appreciate yet. Some things like the death of a loved one we can appreciate, but there may be other types of situations that would have really had a negative impact on your ability to survive and reproduce. And it's hard for us to see that today. But, and just to give an example, the first topic I worked on was postpartum depression. And even today, many people kind of view it as, mom's hormones are going crazy. But if you look at the evidence, I think it's overwhelming that there's a challenge in investing in the new infant. Either your partner is not helping you, you're not getting the social support you need, or the child has health problems, or you have health problems, or there's economic stressors. There's something going on that in ancestral environments would have made it very, very difficult to successfully raise that infant in a situation that mother happens to be in at this point in time. So, and that I think it's better appreciated now, but back when I was working on this in the early 90s, that perspective really wasn't widely appreciated. Even today, I think it's not really as widely appreciated as it should be.
So I guess my first question here is, so I agree with much of what you said. I guess the question I immediately go to is, well, what about folks that we would say are depressed, clinically depressed, and there are no overt or obvious psychosocial or adverse events or stressors? I mean, this will happen often, right? Unless you're just plumbing the depths of their unconscious to find something, latent. They'll be like, look, I got a good family, I got a good job, I got friends, I have hobbies, I have interests, I do all these things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I might not even have a depressed mood. I feel unmotivated. I have increased or decreased sleep, increased or decreased appetite, some type of psychomotor agitation, some type of decreased libido, some type of, whatever we've seen as the characteristic symptoms of depression. What would you say, I guess, because this is typically where people will say, yikes, some of the neurons aren't firing in the brain. And, we have some, TCAs, SSRIs, NDRIs, MAOIs, all the different alphabet, soup of meds to jumpstart it and just try and get the norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin, running the way it does for folks that don't have depression. How would you, I guess, respond to that? Because that certainly appears to happen that way.
Yeah. So what I would say is that's how depression in the DSM should be defined. It should be defined as depressive states without psychosocial stressors. It's not. And that's the big problem.
Interesting. Okay.
So you're right. If in that situation, that's a classic example of a harmful dysfunction and we have other examples of that. We know that your immune system can fire even when there's no pathogen. And that's how we define autoimmune disorders. But if your immune system is firing because you're fighting off a pathogen, that's not a disorder. It's aversive. All this, illness symptoms and sickness symptoms are there, but they're there for a good reason. So yes, if DSM, major depressive disorder, was defined in such a way that folks that were, and that's where you just mentioned the bereavement exclusion. That was the one exclusion up until the DSM-5 when it was removed. And I'm actually interested to hear that they put it back in. I wasn't aware of that. And that was a huge debate.
Yeah.
Because folks like Wakefield and myself are basically arguing that, yes, there are cases of depression where there are no stressors, and those are very convincing candidates for genuine disorders. But most, if you actually look at the data, and I've looked at it pretty carefully, most cases of depression are not like that. Almost all, I would say at least 80% of them have a very clear stressor that triggered the depressive episode. And most of those cases resolve within a year. So typically they're relatively short-lived. Most folks will have one depressive episode in their life if they have any. And most of those cases are triggered by some psychosocial stressor. But when they're not, yes, that's when we have disorder. So what Wakefield has argued for strenuously without success so far, and many others is that we should have something like that in the DSM, that the major depressive disorder should be restricted to folks that are suffering depression either without a major stressor, or where the levels of depressive affect are just vastly beyond the nature of the stressor, that there has been some minor stressor, but it's really, relatively minor compared to the level of distress the person's experiencing.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, because on the last point there, yes, if it scales up to something that is impacting where there's impacting your somatic abilities, right? You really, there's some of what we call the vegetative aspects, right? You sleep or eat or any of the basic functions where it's impacting that in a very, we take, I would say a moderate to severe level, then yes. I'll bring up the bereavement thing since we've mentioned it a few times. Before I do that, I've talked about this a little bit, but I had this really nice long conversation with Lucy Folks. She's a researcher in the United Kingdom, and she wrote a book. Oh boy, it's got two different titles. It's got a title in the UK and it's got a title in the United States. Losing Our Mind is one of the titles. I don't remember which US or UK edition. And we had this conversation, and we got to this point where it was, there are plenty of people that have depression or anxiety or certain things like that. And they get treatment for it. They get psychotropic medications, they get therapy, they get, maybe they get, TMS or something like that. Okay. But there are still, and insurance and managed care covers it or does it or whatever. But the problem is, what we see now, there's a few things here, is that there are folks that do have a tough time. They have a psychosocial stressor, right? Death of a loved one, someone, a relationship ends, a big failure in life, and they have a response to it, right? And maybe there's some chronicity to it, right? It's not just like a one acute thing, but, they're just, and maybe this is where you kind of get in with some temperament things, whatever, personality, whatever. But it's not at the scale of clinical depression. They're going to receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, mild, single episode, blah, 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 right? But in actuality, they probably don't have that. They just have some reaction or response or this cry for help for an adverse event or events, right? And so I'm not going to go so far as to say we're overdiagnosing this, but I think that we don't have a taxonomy or a way of labeling things that is able to contain or to invite some of the gray areas where it's like, look, this isn't clinical, but something is affecting you negatively or adversely, right? That doesn't mean you get a disorder, right? But it does mean that you still need to have treatment, that you still can get some type of treatment. And my hope, and this is something I talked about with Lucy, and I've talked about a few other people, is we can eventually branch out from that to give kind of this taxonomy that you're saying, right? Which I think is more accurate, and I think more representative, because you have many people now that will there's a I want to be mindful and respectful here. There is a type of security that people can feel when they get a label. Ah, yes, this is what I have. Okay. And then that's it, right? It's like, okay, I have the thing. I know what it is. Okay. And then there's opposite reactions to that. And I think that that's not always helpful sometimes, right? Or a lot of the times. And it's like, no, you don't have a clinical disorder, because then you're going to start seeing many people with this, because there is no room for the gray parts of things. They have certain adversive things that happen, and it's terrible, and we're affected by it. Okay, we find ways to try and do this or learn from this or whatever. And so, and I think Lucy and I talked about how there's just no infrastructure for medical or mental health treatment in the UK, NHS, and for DHS here in the United States, for people that have clinical issues, a verified clinical diagnosis, much less people that would fall out of that. So there's just, it's a mess, right? It's a mess on all fronts. But I think the way you're describing it is a much more organized way of explaining things that many clinicians, myself included, have been seeing and noticing for a while. Now, does the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association, heed that and do that and make changes to it? I don't know. Right? There's a lot of politics in that, right? And thankfully, I'm not involved in that whole enterprise. But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, there is a ton of politics, and there's a lot of real issues too. So maybe on the political side, I think we're getting close to $500 million a year in research money flowing to depression research. It's over $400,000 a year from NIH. Wow. And of course, all of that research money is predicated on depression being a mental disorder that we have to find the answer to. Right. So if it's not a mental disorder, suddenly some of that money might be going away. So that could be part of the politics. Another big part of it, I think, more concerning, is insurance is all based on DSM. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people, I think, misinterpret the stuff I'm doing as saying, well, if depression's not a genuine brain dysfunction, then people don't need help. And that's not at all. Yeah. And maybe even that they don't need, antidepressants. I'm not saying that either. So I've broken both my ankles, and I'm really glad there was pain medication. I took my Percocets to kill the pain. Mm-hmm. So there are many situations where we don't have genuine dysfunctions or illnesses, but we still need treatments. Folks really need help. And I think we'll get to this a little bit later. A lot of my work is as you just mentioned, kind of viewing some of the more mysterious symptoms of depression, like suicide and suicidality, as cries for help. So far from saying people don't need help, I'm saying actually some of the mysterious aspects are exactly a cry for help, because people genuinely do need help. But would they, if it left the DSM, would they lose their insurance coverage that is helping them pay for the help that they need? Right. So it's a real dilemma, and I don't have a good solution to it either.
Right. No one has a good answer, but we're all pointing at the same problem. Right. Let me just go back to this bereavement thing real quick, and then we can maybe get to the suicidality thing. So in the DSM-5 TR. Not 5.1, 5 TR, right. Is a new disorder. It's called prolonged grief disorder. This is from, I don't have the TR myself, but I have the 5, but I don't have the TR. But this is from psychiatry.org. It says that grief is a natural response to the loss of a loved one. For most people, symptoms of grief begin to decrease over time. However, for a small group of people, the feeling of intense grief persists, and the symptoms are severe enough to cause problems and stop them from continuing with their lives. Prolonged grief disorder is characterized by this intense and persistent grief that causes problems and interferes with daily life. And then it says here, an individual with prolonged grief disorder may experience intense longing for the person who has died or preoccupation with thoughts of that person. In children and adolescents, the preoccupation may focus on the circumstances around the death. Additionally, the individual may experience significant distress or problems performing daily activities at home, work, or other important areas. The persistent grief is disabling and affects everyday functioning in a way that typical grieving does not. For a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, the loss of a loved one has had to have occurred within at least a year for adults, 6 months for children and adolescents. In addition, the grieving individual must have experienced at least 3 symptoms nearly every day for at least the last month prior to the diagnosis. Those symptoms are identity disruption, such as a feeling as though part of oneself has died, marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain, anger, bitterness, sorrow, difficulty with reintegration, planning for the future, engaging with friends, emotional numbness, absence or marked reduction of emotional experience, feeling that life is meaningless, and intense loneliness. And that it lasts longer than might be expected based on social, cultural, or religious norms. And then it gives some of the epidemiology and etiology. I'll just say, right off the bat here, I have a sticking point conceptually of sorts. But my thing here is the persistent grief is disabling and affects everyday functioning in a way that typical grieving does not. How do you define typical grieving? Everybody grieves differently. And then if you're trying to consider cultural differences as well, like I don't understand the rationale. And it's a thing that you're basically saying, hey, you know what? If you're still grieving and it's affecting you day to day after a year, you get a disorder.
Yeah, I completely agree. What's the principal reason behind any of those
right
statements? And what I really see lacking there is we can imagine. So we've all had more distant relatives die, and we feel sad about that.
Right.
It's really different than if your parent dies.
Of course.
And so where is the really detailed examination of the circumstances, of the social circumstances of that person's death and what they meant to you? It's absent. And yet, obviously, the intensity of grief and how long it lasts is going to be very closely tied to how important that person was to you, how easily they are replaced or not replaced, or the things that they offered you was replaced. There's all kinds of considerations, and none of that is entering into the diagnosis here. So, and we don't have any really principled reasons. And this is where I think evolutionary approaches can really begin to help. We can begin to think about what kinds of things would have, mattered. And I just noticed that they are talking about kids, where the death of a parent, if you're 12, is really different than the death of a parent if you're 42 or 52 or 62.
And additionally, what we know from human development, at least, how I learned it was, we have non-functionality, irreversibility, irreversibility and universality. And that doesn't happen until like age 10. So how are you factoring in concepts of death if you're a child and you're 7, and you don't even understand all the concepts of it? There's a difference of understanding death at 4 or 5, 7, 12, 15, 25. Like there's a difference in understanding death itself. I mean, how can you just say children and adolescents?
You might want to talk to Clark Barrett at UCLA, because that's exactly his area of research is what are children's concepts of death? And what would we expect from an evolutionary perspective? And he has some surprising results in cross-cultural. Kids know more about death than we thought they did. if you kind of ask the questions in the right way, they give the right answers. So some of the...
And where does that fit in with what we know about now about animal minds, about how they understand death? The first thing I think of is elephants, right? I mean, they have some idea of funerals or some variant of that. I mean, I think maybe chimpanzees have some concept of death. I think orcas and dolphins have some concept of death. So how does we're talking about brains, you're talking about evolution, maybe we do have to refine maybe how children know it. They just don't have the language, or they don't have some of the ways of expressing the accuracy of what they're internally experiencing or understanding about death.
Right. And they can still often make correct inferences, that dead people aren't going to do things that live people can do. So even if they don't have, as you say, some of the concepts to the language concepts to express it, they can still think about it and reason about it in ways that make evolutionary sense. So I would really object to this kind of grief disorder, this new grief disorder, the way it's laid out for the exact same reasons that you're raising here, that we don't really have any principled reasons for putting, what's normal. It's reverting to what psychiatry has often done, is using statistical models, that there's a normal, there's a bell-shaped curve, and if you don't fall right in the middle of the curve, you're automatically disordered, but without considering that there might be good reasons why your grief is more intense or long-lasting.
I fully agree. And obviously you're not saying that stats is horrible, or I'm not saying that, but I think using that to then create categories that have particular types of impact. They did this with the DSM-5. They made up a disorder because they didn't want to do pediatric bipolar because it was too taboo or whatever. So they just did disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which is it's so broad and it's so loose, almost any kid that's having, it's very easy to diagnose. And it's like, well, you got, and it fits within the depressive disorders. And so it's only or predominantly looking at the externalizing factors or behaviors, and less so about the internalized ones. And I'm not a fan of the disorder, especially because, again, it's coming from a statistical model and not from, more of a theoretical or one that has a qualitative aspect in concert with, obviously, quantitative and statistical models.
Yeah, and as soon as you slap a disorder label on something, then drug companies are going to develop drugs to treat the disorder, and especially with kids. We really don't understand the developing brain very well at all. And you start giving powerful psychotropic drugs to folks whose brains are still in rapid development. And we really don't know what the consequences of that are. And it may be minimal, but it could be bad. And so I think it's and ADHD really comes to mind here, where it's, again, kind of a broad definition. Diagnosis rates are really skyrocketing, and the typical drugs are these really powerful stimulant drugs that we're giving to folks whose brains are still developing. And so I'm not a huge expert on ADHD, but there is at least some evidence. The evidence that I find most concerning is that, and these are some really interesting studies out of Scandinavia, where they have these, huge cohorts and really track people carefully over the lifespan. And what they notice is that kids whose birthdays are such that they are the youngest kid in the class versus the old. So it's just totally random. It just happens to be where your birthday falls relative to the cutoff for a school grade, get higher rates of diagnosis of ADHD, which really just suggests, that we have kids that are a bit too young developmentally to be, going into third grade. They're not ready for it. And because of that, they're having, behavioral problems that are then leading to them getting, prescribed pretty powerful drugs. So those kinds of things I think really should, raise yellow flags, if not red flags, about the proliferation of all these different disorders.
I absolutely agree. Okay, so I guess a few more things here on depression, and then I do want to talk to you about suicidality. Just a few things. I mean, we talked about the different kinds of models. We've talked about I think some of the really important taxonomy with depression. I think you could scale that to disorders in general. I guess the question I have, some of the other things here, is about, just real quick, on some of the differences. So the epidemiology is 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 females to males.
Yeah,
is there any understanding in terms of gender differences from an evolutionary perspective of why that may be the case? Some people have, I think in the psychological literature, made certain inferences or maybe some correlations that women on average tend to score higher on neuroticism in terms of thinking about Big Five. But, that's not a direct one-to-one correlation. It's definitely not causation. But yeah, just ideas about why it seems to be females higher than males for depression.
Yeah, great question. And I think those are exactly the kinds of challenges that if evolutionary psychology is going to prove its mettle, it should be able to kind of provide compelling answers to exactly those sorts of scientific mysteries. Why do we see this 2-to-1 rate of depression in women compared to men, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of neuroticism, as you say? And you kind of use the word gender there, and I think that's good because I and many other biological anthropologists like to make an important distinction between sex and gender. So sex being biological sex, and gender being all of the aspects of the social environment and culture and cultural norms that kind of surround sex. And so the differences could be gender differences, i.e. differences, cultural differences in social roles for men and women. And I think there's some plausibility if as I and many others argue, that most cases of depression are kind of adaptive responses to adversity. Well, we could easily imagine that there are gender differences in adversity, that women are in different situations than men. They might be experiencing higher rates of adversity. And there's some evidence for that if you can sort of control for things like financial stress, and you can reduce some of the sex difference or the gender difference in depression. Other folks really would be more of a sex difference, that there's differences in the neurobiology of male versus female brains, differences in hormones, or some other aspect of neurobiology, differences in the way that personality factors like neuroticism play into it. I do have a rather speculative hypothesis about the sex difference, and I do look at it as probably a sex difference, and it does kind of relate to sex differences, or in how men and women deal with various kinds of adversity. So adversity often involves conflict, social conflict, and that's actually one of the big. It's extremely well established aspects of depression, but that is not really widely recognized, is that depression is really intertwined with social conflict. Anger is a huge part of depression. It's not one of the symptoms, but it probably should be.
Yeah. I think irritability is one of them for. I know it's definitely in children and adolescents. It's seen as a potential symptom. I can't remember if it's in adults in the moment, but irritability, which is sort of kind of the continuum
sort of in the ballpark there. But there's been a lot of studies. Are rates of anger and social conflict higher? And they are dramatically so. And if we look at many of the risk factors for depression, they are on their face. Situations of conflict, marital conflict is one of the huge risk factors that's widely recognized. Physical assault and sexual assault are probably the most potent risk factors out there for a depressive episode. And of course, that's conflict right on its face there. Problems at work, which often involve conflict with your bosses, huge risk factors for depression. So, if we think about from an evolutionary perspective, not just humans, but other animals, how do animals deal with conflict? Well, they often deal with it with physical aggression, fighting. And if we look at humans, there's one of the biggest physical sex differences in humans is upper body strength.
Right.
So about 90% of men have greater upper body strength than about 90% of women. So basically, almost all men are physically stronger than almost all women. And so if you enter into a situation of social conflict, especially with a member of the opposite sex, if you're a female, you just don't have the ability to physically resolve that conflict in your favor. Physical fighting is not really going to be an option. Whereas for males, physical fighting often would be the way that males would resolve conflicts or threats of physical violence. And so what my colleagues and I have proposed is that at least some of the sex differences in depression are a consequence of this huge sex difference in upper body strength, which is a consequence, which has the consequence or the result of a huge sex difference in how you might resolve conflicts in your favor. So we have examined this in a couple studies now with huge nationally representative data sets where we have measures of upper body strength and measures of depression. And indeed, when we control for upper body strength, much of the sex difference disappears. So much of the sex difference really isn't a sex difference, we argue. It's really a sex difference. It's really a difference in formidability, physical formidability. So that's at least one, and there's a huge amount of work to do to see if that's the right hypothesis, but it's just to illustrate how an evolutionary approach can give us kind of a new insight into how we might think about sex differences in depression. And colleagues of mine have also looked at sex differences in anxiety and upper body strength and sex differences in neuroticism and upper body strength. And they found the same thing that we found with depression, that once you control for differences in upper body strength, a lot of the sex differences in anxiety and neuroticism go away. So it looks like physical formidability, and you think about it, what's anxiety? It's fear of threats.
Right.
Well, who should be more afraid of threats? Those who aren't as physically formidable, kids and females. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So that the vulnerability really is having to do with dealing with conflict and how you deal with conflict and how you can deal, what tools you have to deal with conflict.
Yeah, I think it's a particularly instructive to know kind of at our baseline of understanding of, okay, well, we understand these basic elements, and then how do we understand them, in the body, but then also how things are manifested and look at some of the similarities and differences. And so I think it's particularly powerful how we can understand some things about it. And, obviously, we can't say 100% for sure, but that there's a lot of good data to show that there's some components there. Two last points here on depression. One is on, I'll ask it in this order. So about the postpartum piece of it. Is it postpartum or postnatal? Are those synonymous?
They're synonymous. Okay. U.S. researchers typically say postpartum depression. British ones often say postnatal, but it's the same thing.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding of it is about 80% of women get, what's labeled as the baby blues, right? There's a change in affect, there's a change in mood shortly after conceiving, etc. And that about 10 to 20% have the major depressive disorder with peripartum, I think is what the diagnosis is now. Right. And that an even smaller subset of that 10 to 20%, I think it's 0.1 to 0.2, can sometimes have accompanying psychosis. So it's very rare, very, very rare. Right. But I guess, so what, I know you've done work with this. I mean, what is your, look, again, I know a few things about the reproductive system. And obviously I'm not a woman, but it is a major, I would say almost reconstruction of a woman's not only body, but their emotional systems and physiologically. And I mean, it is a major, major reshifting and restructuring. So, I mean, it is a huge, 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 huge event. And one that begins, you carry a child for almost 10 months, essentially. And then, you're with that child forever, or sensibly until you're off the earth, all things considered. So all these things, and people have multiple children, etc. So how do we have this, marcation of sorts of, this is what we see as normative. I don't like using that word, but, kind of the generalized kinds of things. And then this is something that is, this is a different response or different thing characterologically or something like that, or excuse me, categorically, so yeah, how do we understand some of this?
Yeah. So again, from an evolutionary perspective, there's nothing more central than reproduction. And this is the reproductive event.
Right.
And it's also really valuable just from a scientific perspective, because if we want to understand the relationship between major life events and mood and emotions, the thing about birth is we know when it's going to happen. So right. It makes it really convenient to study. We don't know when a loved one is going to die. Typically, we don't know when our spouse is going to leave us. It's hard to find a population of people where something's going to happen to them on a specific, within a 1 or 2 week time frame. But birth is one of those where we know you're going to definitely be undergoing a major life change. 6 months from now or whenever they enter the study. So that's just kind of a methodological advantage to studying postpartum depression. But it's also an advantage from an evolutionary perspective, because we have really solid theories about parenting and parental investment and the kinds of things that should cause any parent to either invest in the offspring or not invest in the offspring, because you've got a decision point. You had a decision point, to have sex. And so there's a huge amount, as you probably know, of evolutionary psychology. How do people decide to, what mates do they pick and when are they ready to have sex with them or not? That's a big decision point. Here's another one. The kid is born, and are we going to invest in that offspring or not? You actually can make a decision. And we know in many, many species that typically females, but sometimes both parents, are making a decision to invest in the offspring or not. And although most parents in most species, most of the time, will decide to invest in offspring, there are very clear situations where theoretically we would expect them to abandon offspring. And in fact, we do see pretty good evidence that animals do abandon their offspring in those situations if the offspring have severe health problems, if there's not enough resources in the environment, if they happen to be a species with biparental care and one of the parents takes off. And so those same considerations should apply to humans, especially because, as you just point out, you're going to be with that kid and supporting them for a good 15, 20 years.
Definitely, definitely 20 years.
Yeah, definitely. These days, definitely
20
years. Right. So it's a massive investment, and we could almost certainly expect that we have evolved to make good investment decisions, that we should only invest if the investment is going to pay off in evolutionary terms. So what's critical there? It's critical that the offspring be healthy. If you're going to invest. Now, if it has some minor health problem that is easily addressed with some increased investment, you should increase investment. But if it's a really serious major health problem that you probably can't fix, we would expect mothers, at least ancestrally, to abandon the offspring. And we often do see that in hunter-gatherer groups, other groups that are under really severe resource constraints. Infanticide is pretty common. So in many hunter-gatherer groups, women that have twins kill one of the twins because they just simply cannot afford. If they tried to raise both twins would die. So they face a really tough choice, but they have no choice. If they want at least one of the kids to survive, they can't afford to invest in both. And that's actually probably a good explanation why we humans don't regularly have twins or big litters, because moms couldn't successfully raise multiple infants. And that's also why there's postpartum amenorrhea. When women are breastfeeding, it really strongly suppresses fertility. Not only could they not raise two infants at the same time, it's probably true that ancestrally we couldn't really be nursing a kid and be pregnant at the same time, that just the energetic requirements of that are too severe. Other big factors are we know that to successfully raise kids in these small scale societies, you need multiple people helping to raise the kid.
That's right.
Father or the parents or siblings or somebody. And so moms should be assessing, do I have enough social support to successfully raise this offspring? If not, don't. So when moms face this big change, they're going to really assess, is my health there? Maybe my health has suffered over the course of pregnancy or even childbirth. We know that even today, a lot of moms die in childbirth. So they may not be healthy enough to continue investing in the infant. The infant might not be healthy enough to survive anyway. There might not be enough social support. There might not just be enough resources in the environment, regardless of social support. There's just not enough food to go around. So there's all these kinds of factors that should negatively influence mothers' decisions to invest. And that's exactly those things that are risk factors for postpartum depression. And what's the major symptom of postpartum depression? You don't love the baby. You don't care about the baby. So it really looks like it's a set of psychological mechanisms for moms to evaluate their situations. Is this going to be a good investment? And if not, don't invest. Now, what we see in a lot of species, including humans, is you just abandon the infant. Right? You don't actually have to go through any prolonged negative emotional experience. You just take off or you commit infanticide. That's obviously not.
This is in placental mammals. I don't know if it's in marsupial mammals. I don't know if it's in what's the third category. And then you see this in other reptiles, and you see it in other animal groups, where they will abandon an infant or infanticide, and they kill the infant, right? So I guess where do we, if we're again in evolution, an evolutionary model, how do we fit within that kind of umbrella of just other mammals, but other social mammals, and then other just mammals in general, of how they take care of their young? Because you'll read stories all the time about this where, or you'll see a nature documentary where it's just like, oh my God, they're just letting the birds just, die. That's terrible, right? And we have our moral kind of proclivities, but like that happens all the time. So where do humans, I guess, fit in this kind of spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in mammals, not too many mammals have biparental care. Some do, but most don't. So, and humans are one of the major exceptions where biparental care is really critical in humans in a way that it's not in most mammals. So in most mammals where there's just maternal care, we don't expect moms to be assessing social support because it doesn't exist in the first place. They're raising the kids themselves. So what we would expect is for them to assess things like access to resources and health and things like that, but they wouldn't be assessing the availability of social support. So humans, we are unique among, we're pretty unique among the primates. There are some primates that do have biparental care, but not chimpanzees, for example, not our closest relatives. But we're going to be assessing biparental care. Now, birds most of them have biparental care. So we would expect birds to be assessing the extent to which their partners are committed to providing resources to the brood. Now, one of the differences that we might see in humans is the social support might not be there initially, but you could change that potentially. And this is one of my some of my work on postpartum depression is, why don't moms just, abandon the infant immediately or commit infanticide? Well, we obviously have extremely strong social norms against infanticide in our culture, not in all cultures, but in ours for sure. Right. So moms don't really have the freedom to just commit infanticide or abandon the infant. But in many cases, it wouldn't be in their interest, because what if you don't have enough social support now, but you could convince partners that they better invest, or you're going to abandon the infant. And so this is where we kind of get into my ideas about signaling, that moms that have postpartum depression typically, and there is variation here, but they really have trouble loving the baby. They have trouble taking care of the baby. They're unresponsive to when the baby cries or needs feeding. And this becomes very quickly apparent to the dad and other people around the mom. And of course, everybody is kind of thinking, what's wrong with the mom? But what I would argue is what's wrong with the social environment there? Why aren't the moms getting the support they need? And there might be, dad's a workaholic, or dad has got some, big situation at work, or whatever it is, or maybe he's not committed to this relationship. But that might change, that kid is his kid too. It's the grandparents' kids. It's the aunts and uncles' kids. And if they see that the mom is not investing in the infant, they may decide, you know what, I'm going to step up and help because that's, and there might be evolved mechanisms to do that. It will actually increase their fitness if they invest in that offspring. But what they need is they need to know from mom that this current situation isn't working for her. And this is where I think, the illness model really misleads us, is it really focuses us on what's wrong with the mother and what's wrong with her hormones, instead of thinking about what's wrong with her social situation and how might the kinds of things that she's doing or not doing really be aimed at getting, for example, the social support she needs to deal with maybe an infant that would thrive if she could get more investment, even if it has, let's say, some minor health problems or something like that.
Is there, I guess the last point on this is there a type of kind of a cognitive, or not even a cognitive, but like a type of dissonance for mothers right afterwards of this? Do I have the resources to take care of the child? And, do I or do I not? Or do I have enough? Or, is it just because of the, it is a stressor, it's a big life event, I guess what is the kind of mechanisms of, when I say dissonance, I mean something along the lines of, some of my, my parts of my DNA have a lot of an evolutionary code here. But, I live in a modern world where we have norms and we have morals and we have all these other things. Is that kind of going on just kind of intrinsically, if you were to, do an ethnograph, or you were to do a structural interview or whatever, and just ask, moms that have postpartum or whatever, or seem to have some of the symptomatology, and you were to ask them to describe the phenomenological experience of what they're feeling or going through, would it be this kind of like, I have these weird feelings and I don't know why kind of thing? And is it kind of a, again, this kind of evolutionary code that's kind of like pushing through, but we're living in a modern world with all these morals and norms? What's the kind of push and pull there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. One is what mothers very consistently say who are suffering is that they want to love the baby. They expected to love the baby. They were really looking forward in many cases to this, bonding experience, and they're extremely bitter that that was denied them by postpartum depression. So it's definitely, one of the most distressing experiences that these women have gone through. Now, some experience it during pregnancy. So depression during pregnancy is actually also really common. And there's quite a lot of research to what extent does pregnancy depression then predict postpartum depression. It's not as straightforward as you would think. It's kind of there, and we really don't exactly still know how the two relate to each other. But yes, there is quite a bit of anger and disappointment and bitterness that they're being denied what they were hoping to be, the most loving and bonding experience of their lives. And instead, it's often this nightmare. Now, the second thing that you kind of raise is, could this be a mismatch with the modern environment? And there are folks that really are pursuing that angle. But yeah, in the modern environment, food is typically not an issue. There are, of course, people that experience food insecurity, but a lot of moms that aren't experiencing that still are struggling with postpartum depression from resource stress. So even though it's, in an evolutionary, in this evolutionarily novel environment, it's really unlikely that the kid's going to starve enough money, or their husband's not bringing in enough money, or their job situation is insecure. So there could be this kind of mismatch that mom's evolved psychology is telling them that they don't have enough resources to take care of the kid, even though they actually really do. And that might be why it's difficult for folks to see what's going on with moms. Like, hey, you're, the suburban soccer mom, you've got your SUV and your house in the suburbs, what's wrong with you? But they don't realize she's at home all day by herself, isolated from everybody. She's not getting those social cues that her community cares about her and her kid. And it's not that they don't, but you need those daily interactions, and those aren't just there if you're nursing the baby home alone by yourself, and your husband's not getting home till 8:30 at night,
right.
And he's leaving at 6 a.m. Those could be giving all kinds of cues that this is a bad environment to raise the kid.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask about cross-culturally. I know you've done a lot of work in a few, I think at least one African country, and then in South America as well. So I want to ask about that. But what I want to do is, before that, we can say that kind of for the end of sorts, unless you think it's relevant here. But I want to ask about suicidality, and I want to ask about your research on that and your work on that, about how suicidality is a type of signal. What's the role of powerlessness and hopelessness in suicide, and then some of the inclusive fitness model, et cetera. So just tell us about suicide in general, and then your work on it, and what's your angle and what you look at it, how you look at it, and then we can just kind of do a whole bit on all the things we've been talking about cross-culturally, where there's similarities and differences.
Right. So earlier we were talking about depression as psychological pain and how analogous it is to physical pain. But the fly in the ointment for that argument is, when I broke my ankle, it hurt like hell, but I didn't think about killing myself. And yet, in many cases of, so in physical pain, of course, there are folks with chronic physical pain where suicide does come up. But for, the typical person that's broken a bone or has some severe physical injury, but they can see the light at the end of the tunnel, or the painkillers are working. Suicidality isn't really an issue, and often with depression it is. And so that, if there's anything that doesn't make evolutionary sense, it's suicide. Right. The worst way to survive and reproduce is to kill yourself.
Right.
So many evolutionary scholars have really kind of tried to grapple with suicide and how can we understand it from an evolutionary perspective. And one of the earliest approaches, as you just briefly mentioned there, is called the inclusive fitness model. And that comes from the insight that from William Hamilton in the 1960s, that one way that organisms across the domains of life can increase their biological fitness is not by increasing their own reproduction, but by contributing to the reproduction of close relatives with whom they share genes. And that actually is now the accepted explanation. Why do we invest in our kids? We share genes with them. But why would I invest in my sister's kids? Well, I'm related to them too. So one of the ideas is that you can actually have a negative impact on your own fitness if you're really dragging your relatives down. So we can imagine in a small scale society, if somebody was severely disabled, and this is a society that has to move around, they're mobile hunter-gatherers, they can't stay in any one place for that long. And if one of their members is really ill, and the members of the group are your kids and their kids and your siblings, all your relatives, your disability is really decreasing their fitness, not just your own fitness. So one of the early ideas by Dennis de Canzaro, it's a pretty clever idea, is maybe in that situation, you should kill yourself so that you're no longer a burden on your relatives. And that will actually increase your inclusive fitness. So that is one of the main evolutionary ideas out there. Now, I'm pretty skeptical of that idea because why doesn't the group just leave? If it's in their interests to not invest in you and take care of you, they don't have to. Or you could just walk away if you are able to, rather than killing yourself, because at least that preserves some chance of you reproducing on your own. So if somehow you're dragging everybody else's fitness down, disperse. Just leave. The group should leave you, or you should leave the group. You shouldn't really kill yourself and forestall any opportunity. So that's one reason I'm skeptical of it. The other reason I'm skeptical of it is we see a lot of suicidal behavior in people who are young and healthy.
So this is clinically we call this self-injurious behaviors. Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah, things like self-injury, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. I'll talk about that in a moment. And that doesn't make any evolutionary sense. If you're a young, healthy person, you really have no idea what's going to happen in the next 10 years or 20 years. You really cannot, there's no way that you have the information to conclude that it's somehow adaptive to kill yourself. Yeah. So I was skeptical of all these ideas. So I started looking at the data, and what really jumps out very clearly and very quickly is that most suicidal behavior is non-lethal. So under the inclusive fitness model, you should really kill yourself with 100% certainty. Because if you try to kill yourself and you fail, you're now an even greater burden on kin. So if you're going to do it, you better do it in a way that's 100%. And yet what we see, the evidence is really overwhelming, is that rates of suicide attempts, there's in young adult women are literally over 100 times more there are over 100 attempts for every completion. Right. So the vast majority of suicidal behavior is non-lethal behavior. And so that suggests a very different idea, which we refer to as the costly signaling idea. Now, I mentioned earlier how important social conflict is in depression, and it's also really critical in suicide or suicidality. And if we think about physical pain, you fall down, you scrape your knee, and you're a young kid, or you break your ankle, and you start crying. You start signaling for help. And that's going to work as long as people want to help you and they believe you. Now, if you cry wolf too often, people are going to stop running to help you. And this is a general problem in evolutionary models of signaling, is that if there's conflicts between individuals, there's incentives for individuals to send deceptive signals that you need help when you really don't. And then there's going to be selection on the potential receivers of those signals to ignore those signals. And because conflict is such a big part of depression and suicide, that people need help, but they're often in situations where they're in conflict with key social partners. And that's the part that people don't really recognize. They need help, but there's reasons that their social partners might not believe them or might not have an incentive to help them due to social conflict. And the question is, how do you get your social partners to believe you when they think you might be crying wolf or there's some other conflict? And there's a whole body of literature called credible signaling or costly signaling theory, which proposes that the way that organisms, not just humans, but in many, many different species have evolved to solve this problem is they evolve what are called costly signals. And there's a very rich mathematical literature on this, but the basic idea is that the signal is such that cheaters can't afford to send the signal. And so kind of one of the earliest expressions of this idea in economics is if you want to show that you're wealthy, you buy an expensive car, and the only way that you can afford that car is if you actually were a millionaire. So the way to really credibly signal wealth is with this ostentatious displays of wealth, things that the normal person couldn't afford, but you can. It's a credible signal that you genuinely are wealthy, because talk is cheap. I could say, "Oh, I'm a millionaire." Well, prove it.
Right.
Well, if I walk into the Porsche showroom and lay down the cash for the Porsche, then okay, I've proved it. Mm-hmm. So that general idea we think plays a lot of role in sexual signaling, where males evolve these. The peacock's tail is the classic example here, where it evolves a structure that credibly signals to the female that it has good genetic quality. Whereas that peacock that had some severe genetic mutations just simply couldn't grow the tail to begin with. Mm-hmm. So what we're arguing is that suicidality is a similar costly signal of need. It's a credible signal of need. You've got conflicts with social partners. They have incentives to not believe you. Yeah. So let's just imagine a situation where, and we've actually done studies with exactly this scenario, where mom has a new boyfriend, and he moves in, and the 12-year-old daughter really hates the new boyfriend, because previously mom was putting all her attention into the daughter, but now she's putting attention into the new boyfriend. Mm-hmm. So there's conflict. Now, the daughter has an incentive to try and get rid of the boyfriend. So she might deceptively claim, "Oh, he's sexually harassing me or sexually abusing me." But the mom might not believe her, because she knows that her daughter hates the boyfriend and wants her to just dump the boyfriend and invest more in her. So how can the daughter, if the daughter genuinely is being sexually harassed or abused by the boyfriend, how can she convince the mom that she's telling the truth? And what we argue is, if she actually attempts suicide, if she was faking it, she couldn't afford to put her own life at risk if she wasn't genuinely being harassed. But if she is genuinely being harassed, her fitness in that situation is going to be quite low, because she might, get pregnant by somebody who's not going to invest in her. That will ruin her mate value. So if she is genuinely being sexually harassed or sexually abused by the boyfriend, a suicide attempt is going to convince the mother that her daughter is telling the truth, because she wouldn't do that if it wasn't really happening. So we argue that in situations where there are severe social conflicts, you need a costly signal of need to convince skeptical social partners that you actually genuinely need help. And some of our research has shown that indeed, in situations where there is social conflicts, things like depression, severe depressive episodes, or suicide do increase folks' belief that you are telling the truth, and where initially they were skeptical, and that you deserve more help than you're getting. So that's our kind of signaling approach to, and you earlier mentioned the vegetative signals of depression. We think those actually operate the same way, that in situations of social conflict, how do you know the mom can't afford the baby? Maybe she just wants everybody to, give her attention. Maybe she's selfish. But if she's not only not taking care of the baby, but not even taking care of herself, that's a credible signal that she genuinely can't afford to take care of this infant. And the same in other kinds of situations of depression. It's a way of credibly signaling. So if somebody dies, maybe you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself, but you still want more attention, you want more help. That'd be great. Who wouldn't want that? How do you convince skeptical partners that actually that death is impacting you so severely that you really do need extra help? Well, if you're not actually taking care of yourself, if you're not doing just the everyday things that people should be doing, the only way you could afford to do that is if it was genuinely the case that you were in a dire situation. So again, in situations of conflict, where there's conflict with key social partners, you may need to turn to these costly signals, like the severe symptoms of depression or suicidal behaviors, to convince skeptical social partners you're telling the truth.
It's very fascinating how there's many people have said that, like, it's a cry for help. But it is in one sense. Of course, that's a very elementary way of saying that. But that there's all of this signaling that's going on of how much legitimate pain that people are in when they are at this place of self-injurious behavior, suicidal ideation, and or attempts. And it is, it always is a very, how do I say, it's a sobering thought, because people are, every single person we meet, every single person that we walk, encounter on the street, on the bus, on the train, on the airplane, on, wherever, everyone's got some pains they're carrying around. Now, it's a very cynical outlook, but it's also a very realistic one. I got them, you got them, everyone's got them. And we don't know the depths of it and the extent of it, and how much, human experience is wonderful, but it also has so many difficult parts to it, and so I always think about that, and you never know, right? It's just when you get that news headline of, so and so, an actor or actress or whomever it is, committed suicide today, and it hits you, but it's like you don't know how much what they were going through, what was going on for them, and so it's an interesting reminder.
Yeah, and sexual, assaults there are these very private relationships. How do you know that person is in a sexually abusive relationship?
That's right.
It's extremely difficult, and we think that's not true just today, but that it was always true, that it was very difficult to know when that was actually happening and when it was not. And that's why we think we need to have evolved these credible signals of that. And indeed, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault are one of the biggest risk factors for suicidality. We don't think that's an accident. Yeah,
and it happens in all different types of relationships. Some people will say like, oh, just the random stranger or whatever, but this happens a lot in marriage. This happens a lot in committed relationships, unfortunately. And that's also very
family members,
right.
That are supposed to be, your Uncle Bob, and it turns out Uncle Bob is, sexually abusing you. Nobody knew it until you attempted suicide. Unfortunately, had to get to that point. And part of the argument, I just want to kind of fill out the argument here, is in over our evolution, in these small communities, everybody was interdependent. Everybody depended on everybody else. And so we can really clearly see that in the postpartum case. That baby isn't surviving. That, it's the father's child as much as the mother's child. But if the mother doesn't take care of the infant, the dad's infant isn't surviving either. Or if you're in a community, everybody's got to contribute to getting food or taking care of kids. So there's a high level of interdependence. So if you threaten to kill yourself, or if you're very depressed, you're not doing things that the other group needs you to do.
That's right, yeah.
And so you have a lot of, and we kind of view this as what we call the labor strike model. Just as in a company, the manager of the company require the workers to work or they're not going to get their profit, everybody in these small scale communities requires other folks to be doing their part or they're not going to make it either. So that high level of interdependence gives people leverage. If they would threaten to put their own health and well-being at risk, it's actually going to have a big negative impact on everybody else, and everybody else is going to pay attention. So we think things like severe depression and suicidality are kind of taking advantage of the fact that you do have bargaining power, just as workers in a factory have bargaining power if they go on strike. We kind of view that, and we call this kind of the labor strike model of depression.
The last question, there's, there's so many things, there's so many other things that you've researched that I want to talk to you about, but the last question here that I'll ask you though, is just really the cross-cultural kinds of elements here. Obviously, like I said, you've done work in different continents and you've looked at this, many of these topics that you've been highlighting today and discussing at great length today about, whether it's postpartum stuff, whether it's just overall mental health, evolutionary medicine, depression, etc. What can you just say for any and all of the topics we've discussed today of how this, we now have some idea of what it looks like maybe in the United States or in the quote unquote West, but what does this look like, in the places that you've studied and other places you've studied, or just more generally cross culturally? How does this look? How is it different? How is it similar, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the early studies I did was on postpartum sadness. So we were working in a small native Amazonian group in the Amazon with my colleague Clark Barrett. And we began interviewing moms about their postpartum experiences. And these are, small hunter horticultural societies where you got to get all the food on the table. You've got to work to put the food on the table every day, or somebody does. There's no markets here. Right. My colleague, Clark Barrett, who'd been working in this village for years and had invited me to come down and kind of do this work there, we both started interviewing these moms. And it took a while. It really took Clark's, the community trusted him. So for men to interview these guys' wives, that doesn't happen. So the fact that Clark was able to get the husbands to kind of agree to let us talk to their wives, that was a big breakthrough. And what came pouring out of these women were just all their trials and tribulations with their husbands, none of which we had suspected, but how they had been cheating on and abandoned, and how all their money, the guys were spending all their money in the cities on other women and prostitutes. And it just came pouring out. And of course, when we really did all the stats, the women's that indeed did have what they called, postpartum sadness. Because at first we just initially asked, have you ever heard of this, where women, don't love the baby when it's, and they, we call that, sadness after the birth, so they knew about it. Uh-huh. And when we began investigating it, indeed, both during pregnancy and postpartum, it was strongly related to either health problems with the child or their own health problems or lack of support from the husband. So it ended up looking very, very similar to what we see here. Now, when I started looking at suicide across cultures, I would say the model actually has its strongest support in evidence from these small scale societies, where it really jumps out because of that interdependence that I talked about. It really became apparent to the ethnographers that have been working on this, that when people threaten suicide, it really does put their value. If the wife is threatening to kill herself, everything that the husband, all of his social status depends on her taking care of the kids and the household, and all that would be going away. Yeah. So it's a real big threat to the husband, and they pay attention to it. If the kids threaten suicide, the parents pay very close attention, because there are many, many examples of kids attempting suicide or succeeding at killing themselves in situations of conflict. So the dynamic, the kind of signaling and bargaining dynamic that we have proposed really jumps out extremely clearly in the ethnographic evidence in these small scale societies.
Wow. Yeah, that's again, it just kind of what we were talking about in the beginning just speaks about kind of the universals of things, and kind of the power of the evolutionary model in understanding not just sexual selection or anything like that, or natural selection, but also our mood and our brain and our environment and things like that. And so I think it's particularly important to view many things through that lens and frame. Well, look, Ed, it's you've been more than generous with your time, and I can't say enough thanks for that. This was so much fun. Give me 2.5 hours of talking about your fabulous research. I've obviously learned a lot of things, but I usually walk away from these conversations thinking about it for days and weeks afterwards, and I'll remember conversations months later. And so you definitely have given me much to think about, and I think listeners will also really have a lot to ponder and think about as well. So you're just a treasure, all the work you're doing. Where can people find your work and find you in all the relevant places?
Yeah, just Google Ed Hagen, and my websites will show up. And if you search for Ed Hagen on Twitter, I'm on Twitter as well. So yeah, I come up pretty quickly on Google, and all my papers are posted on my website. So feel free to take a look.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Again, I mean, thanks so much for coming on. I had such a good time, and your reputation is definitely holds. You are quite brilliant, and it was a lot of fun. So I greatly appreciate it, man.
Okay, it's fun for me too. Glad to be here.
All right, thanks.